Well, if you have a copy of Scriptures, that will be our teaching text today, 1 Kings chapter 18. My name is Daniel. Welcome to Journey Church. I get the opportunity to teach God's Word today and serve here as one of the pastors as we teach through installment number 2 of Fire, Faith, and Flower, Lessons from the Life and Ministry of Elijah and Elisha. And throughout the next 8 weeks, it'll be 9 weeks in total, but this is week 2. We're specifically diving into 1st and 2nd Kings, from 1 Kings 17 all the way to 2 Kings chapter 13. Kind of just working through this passage by passage, story by story, but focusing in on these two prophets, Elijah and Elisha. And last week, we were introduced to the character of Elijah in 1 Kings 17, of how the Lord worked on him before he decided to work through him in his life. And some background was required for us on the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. And I want to kind of just give us a recap of some of the stuff that I shared for those of you who may be joining us new or those who just maybe slept once or twice since last Sunday. And so the nation of Israel has been successful through 2 primary kings. That's David and Solomon. But after Solomon, everything kind of falls apart and the kingdom gets divided. And here's a picture behind us of what the nation of Israel looked like after the divided kingdom. You have the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, capital city Samaria, and then the southern kingdom of Judah with the capital city of Jerusalem. And Elijah does the majority of his ministry in the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom of Israel, here's one thing we have to understand fully, has had 19 kings over 200 years of history, and not a single one of them is good. 19 kings over 200 years of history, and not one of them is good. And when Elijah gets introduced on the scene and called by God, because it's as if in the book of 1 Kings that God has shifted his focus from working through kings because they're all wicked to say, I need a prophet to speak truth to power. And that's kind of what 1 Kings 17 picks up on the scene, is he speaks to the worst of the worst. His king is named Ahab, and he marries a woman named Jezebel, who arguably is the worship leader for the false gods. She introduces, along with the other kings in her who have come before her, these false gods, these little g gods that they've introduced to the nation of Israel to worship in this way. And Elijah in this scene, the crux of this story and this sermon is just simply titled, Choose. Choose. Because Elijah, and what we'll understand is as he comes back on the scene to Ahab, his major concern is the lack of the ability of the Israelites to choose who will they worship. They want, the nation of Israel almost wants their cake and to eat it too. They want both. And I believe what you'll see in this story is it's not that they hate Yahweh, the one true God, but they want him along with these other additions in their life. So I thought, a good way to break the ice, if you will, is a good old-fashioned game of this or that. So I just got 5 questions. I want to learn a little bit about the audience of all of you, the body who's here today, and I'm going to play along with us. And a game of this or that, if you've never played this or that, is you have to pick this or that. You can't say both. Okay? I'm going to give you 2 polar opposite choices, and you got to pick one. That's the rule. You got to pick. You can't say like, well, both of those sound nice. That's not the game, okay? You got to pick one, all right? I'm just going to do simply 5 of them. A vacation or a staycation? Vacation, raise your hand. Staycation, raise your hand. Oh, okay. I got some staycationers. All right, here we go. All right, you get the concept, all right? All right, owe money or owe a favor? Owe money or owe a favor? Owe money? Raise your hand. Nobody's trying to owe money. Everybody said, oh, a favor. All right, we're all doing a favor. All right, you get the concept. We got 3 more we're going to roll through. Be the driver or be the passenger? You're going somewhere. Be the driver or be the passenger? Drivers? I was looking to see if I had any married couples that both of them were raising their hands, okay? Passengers? All right, okay. Last 2, all right? Be embarrassed or be afraid? We're getting vulnerable now. Be embarrassed or be afraid? Be embarrassed? Be afraid. All right, everybody's like, yeah, I'll take fear. I'll take fear every time, okay? Last one. This is the most important one that will reveal the most about your heart. Coffee or tea? Coffee? Tea? Okay, just a few of you. We'll have an altar call at the end, okay, inside of this. All right, well, you get the point. The premise of that game is there's many of them who are like, well, I like coffee and tea. I mean, maybe based on the circumstances, I'd rather stay home than go on vacation. But the point in that is we had to pick. And that's Elijah's major concern. Elijah's major concern with the nation of Israel over their hearts is they want all the gods, they want all of them to be able to worship them freely. And I believe the posture of the heart of the nation of Israel reveals a lot about us. But let's set up this scene to see where Elijah gets us to of picking. Choose for yourself who you will serve. 1 Kings 18, verses 1 and 2. Here's how the scene sets. After a long time, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year. Go and present yourself to Ahab. I will send rain on the surface of the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. If you remember a little bit about last week in chapter 17, verse 1 was kind of the only public verse that happened before the Lord drove Elijah to secrecy or to private. In verse 1 of chapter 17, he was called by God to go walk in front of Ahab and said, hey, it's not going to rain until I says it's going to rain, all right? That's basically what he says. And he says, by the word of the Lord, there's going to be no rain. And you may be thinking, well, great, we'll have time to get outside. But this is an agrarian society. They depend on rain for their economy. Not only their economy, but their food supply, their water supply. It's all based on if it rains or not. And it's been 3 years. Note that out there in chapter 18, verse 1. It's been 3 years. So it's been 3 years without rain at least. A famine has come over the land. A drought has been over the land. It's 3 years. Elijah has been in secrecy of some kind, being developed by the Lord. And now the Lord says, okay, now it's time. Go back, present yourself to Ahab. And this is where he is on a mission to do so. But from verse 3 to 16, as Elijah is leaving the Wadi Cherith and whatever town he's maybe found himself in at this point, he runs across an old prophet friend who his name is Obadiah. And Obadiah has been serving in the king's courts, one of the only true prophets of God who have not abandoned the God of Israel to worship those other false gods. And Ahab has kind of made him his right-hand man in some respects and said, hey, you head that way, I'll head this way. We got to find Elijah because it needs to rain. But Obadiah finds Elijah first, and he's like, man, you would never believe what's happening. They've killed a bunch of prophets. Jezebel is terrible, and all these weird things that he tells him. And Elijah simply gives Obadiah the instruction, hey, you go back to Ahab, tell him this. And he goes, I don't want to go back to him. He'll kill me if I go back and tell him that. And eventually, Obadiah just has to kind of settle up and do what Elijah wants him to do and serve Elijah. And so he does it. He listens, and he goes back to find him. But it's almost as if the text presents itself that somehow Ahab finds Elijah before Obadiah finds Ahab. And this is what he says. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, is that you, the one ruining Israel? And I don't know if you like a little jawing, but I like a little jawing the best with them, all right? Like watching a football game or whatever the case may be, because Elijah had been waiting 3 years for this comeback, all right? And this is what he says. I've not ruined Israel, but you and your father's family have, because you've abandoned the Lord's commandments and you've followed Baal's. Now summon all Israel to meet me at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Elijah, one man who've been shaped and molded for 3 years of confidence and dependence. We talked about the cycle, the 3 stages, if you will, that Elijah goes through. And there's some more complexities that we were able to not draw out last week, but we simply identified 3 stages that all of us in life go through, that Elijah was brought to a season of humbling, a season of dependence, and a season of obedience. And all of us, we go through these stages of our life where the Lord works on us because he desires to work through us. And now, it's as if Elijah has been molded and shaped for such a time as this, and he needed to depend upon the Lord because he basically said, 950 versus me, and I like my odds. Like that's a lot of like gall in this 850. I just did bad math in my head. All right, so 400 and 450. Points it out, just honesty. I had to correct my own mistake. I can't just let that sit there because you'll talk about it in the lobby. Math is hard sometimes. And the two figures that he points out, what I want you to notice in this is he points out kind of three key words. He says, your father and your father's table have led them to worship the Baals, plural. And this is almost used as this catch-all term of all the false gods that you've introduced into this kingdom and you've encouraged the people to worship. But then he also uses Baal as singular, and he uses the term Ashariah. All right, so I just want to give us a little bit of like archaeological history background before we try to get a grasp of what's going on. And so the two prophets of Baal is known as the storm god. And here's just a stone that has been recovered throughout history of just like this depiction of what it was thought of that this individual was. He's a storm god, a false god that was worshipped during this time. And the second is a depiction of Ashariah, which is the name means she who walks on the sea. And so it's as if they paint this picture of a god and a goddess, if you will, in this Eastern mythology. And the point that Elijah is trying to make out here in verses 17 through 19 is he's trying to place blame on where blame should be placed. Because notice how Ahab says, you are the one ruining Israel because you're the one who said it wasn't going to rain and it hasn't rained. But Elijah turns the tables back to Ahab and he says, no, get one thing straight. This is just the fallout of your leadership, of leading the nation of Israel to worship false gods and goddesses. And in fact, the ones who eat at your wife's table. And so what does this terminology really mean? It's as if those in power of the king and the queen have set the stage for this false worship. It's not only been encouraged, but propagated for the prophets to turn the tables away from the one true God and say, well, I got to eat. I want to eat the king's choice food. I want to make sure that I have water and my family has water. So it's at some level practical for them to switch sides, for them to introduce the worship of Ashariah and Baal into their own life. And that's what is concerning to Elijah. It's not just the worship of the false gods, but it's hey, I'll take that too. Because it's not as if they've abandoned Yahweh, but they says, oh, we want Yahweh and Baal and Ashariah and any other thing that's practical. Which is inside of that, replacing God or saying God plus anything is false worship. Because here's the concern of what leads us to the scene of the big, if you want to call it the showdown. Look at verse 20 and 21. So Ahab summoned all the Israelites. He did what Elijah requested. Hey, let's meet at Mount Carmel or Carmel, however you want to pronounce that. And gathered all the prophets at Mount Carmel. Then Elijah approached all the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people didn't answer him a word. A lot of theologians almost believe that in this phrasing that they were unable to answer. Because it was almost that they were playing a game of this or that, and they were like, I like both. Notice the posture of their heart in this is it's not that they've abandoned God. Because if they abandoned God and they fully, wholeheartedly believed that Yahweh was not God and Baal was God, they'd be like, okay, we pick Baal. This is my God. But they couldn't. They were straddling the fence between two opinions. They're like, I really like what Yahweh said. He's kind of the God of my ancestors and the God of my history. But Baal is the storm god and it hasn't rained in a while. We like our odds here. You see, the whole concept of idol worship is the perplexity of why they could not answer is because they also knew what God had said. It's in the Big Ten, not the conference, the 10 Commandments. A few of you got that, okay? And this is what it says, Exodus 20, verses 2-4. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have any other gods besides me, and do not make an idol for yourself. It's the first things out of God's mouth. God tells them, I'm the one who's rescued you. I've redeemed you from the place of slavery. I've plucked you out of your sin. Therefore, here's the thing, don't put anybody in my rightful place. And it would be easy for us to look at an application for ourselves today and be like, Daniel, I'm pretty set. I have no stone or wooden altar at my house that I bow to before I exit the door every day. I have nothing that I bow the knee to and worship each and every day. I'm good to go. We've made a really bad misstep there. Because here's 4 frame-ups for idols that I want us to kind of get around and try to probe in our own hearts about if we could actually relate a lot more to the Israelites rather than the prophet Elijah who's going to show down with a bunch of them. Here's the 4 truths. 4 truths on idols. Number 1, idols are not always bad things. Think of the practicality of the Israelites, farmers who have been 3 years without any rain. And for a long time, Yahweh, the one true God, had been in provision. They've been providing. It had been fruitful in the land. They had stuff to eat. Families, their bellies were full. Their kids were well set. And then all of a sudden, it stopped. And the person in power said, hey, I've got a God who's the God of the storms, God of rain. Why don't you try worshiping him too? If you're in a desperate situation, what would you do? Try to think of it from their perspective. Like, you're 900 BC and you're like, I'm trying to do the best I got. And for you and I in our life, often idols start in this way. It was never intended to take the place of God, but it was a good and practical idea that started getting some footing in my heart. You see, because the second truth is this: idols are good things we put in God's place. Now, I'm not saying Baal is good of the false god, but I'm saying for you and I, it's a good thing we put in God's place. It's a thing we pursue that we desire to have, and we'll sacrifice anything for it. Is there anything like that in your life? That you'll sacrifice anything for this thing? Because here's the third thing. Idols promise what only God can truly provide. The promise of an idol is something that only God can truly provide. You see, it's practical for the Israelites, but it's also practical for you and I. This is the situation that the Israelites find themselves at a shell shock of unable to really answer a this or that question. Baal or Yahweh? Pick. And they're frozen because they can't. Because they know the life that they've chosen to live, and they've put themselves in this situation. Because here's the fourth thing. An idol is anything you value more than God. It's anything you value more than God. Here's the summation. Satan does everything for you to put anything in God's rightful place. Satan does everything for you to do anything, to put anything in God's rightful place. Think of that. The enemy works in such a way of distraction. The enemy works in such a way to get you off base in one area or many areas. Whether it's your vocation, a promotion, a trip, your family even, money itself, relationships, a relationship, a sports team. The list could go on and on and on. A trinket, a toy, a hobby, it doesn't matter. What are the things you sacrifice for to get to? Just to find at the end of the day, they really didn't matter that much in the first place. This is the situation that Elijah and the whole nation of Israel in the northern kingdom are at this showdown with. So when you get to verse 22 in this story, Elijah challenges and he specifically points out the 450 prophets of Baal or Baal, however you want to pronounce that, who is the false god. And he sets up this stage of the showdown early in the morning, one morning, and he says, hey, 2 bulls. Take 2 bulls, which is the normal sacrifice. You take your pick of one, and I'll take the other one. And we're going to make a sacrifice, and we're going to build an altar, but we're not going to strike a match. We're going to trust our God to provide, to do what only He can do, and light the fire on this sacrifice. So they stacked woods. They couldn't light the wood. They sacrificed the animal. They put the animal on the altar, and they began to pray as they prepared it. Verse 26 says this is how the showdown began. So they took the bull, this is the false prophets of Baal, and gave it to him and prepared it, and they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, Baal, answer us. But there was no sound. No one answered. They danced around the altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah mocked them, and he said, shout loudly, for he is God. For he's a God, maybe he's thinking it over. Maybe he wandered away. Maybe he's on the road. Perhaps he's sleeping and will wake up. They shouted loudly. They cut themselves with knives and spears according to their customs until blood gushed over them. All afternoon they kept on raving until the offering of the evening sacrifice, but there was no sound. No one answered. No one paid attention. See, in this scene of all the pomp and circumstance of their beckoning their God to do something, to provide, to do the thing that He had promised to do, and they silence. So Elijah gathers up the nation of Israel. He gathers them around the broken down altar of the Lord, and he repairs it. You see, an altar in the Old Testament was oftentimes where God would meet with His people in a holy place. It was a place of transformation oftentimes. It was a place where people worshiped the true God and they thanked Him for providing for them in some type of way. It was never really a place to beckon God to do something or almost pay God off or to feed God, as many other cultures look at altars for their little g gods, but it was a place of worship. It was a place where generations could be reminded that their God they served was alive and active and was always providing and shepherding His people generationally. Because we as forgetful people need reminders often. So as Elijah gathers up the nation of Israel and he puts the 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of the nations of Israel, which remember at this point is broken in half. The nation is fractured. And he chooses to rebuild it and symbolize, remember what we used to be when we genuinely followed God. And we've abandoned that. So he builds this altar. Then he digs a trench. Big enough trench, the writer of 1 Kings decides to give us this description for 4 gallons of water. And he instructs the nation of Israel, go and get 4 gallons of water. But remember, the context of this story is it's been 3 years of a drought. It begged the question for me, where'd they find water? This was the most precious commodity that they could ever have in this moment. And Elijah is going to use it as an act of worship and sacrifice. I'm going to sacrifice the thing that is the most precious to me in this moment, to leave absolutely no doubt of who God is. And remember, the other prophets he's challenging worship the storm god, the God of rain. Leave no doubt. See, in this game of this or that for Elijah, there was no choice. It was a matter of fact. Like for those of you in the room who hate the taste of coffee, there was no choice for you. It was like tea all day. For those of you who are in panic when you're in the passenger seat because you're not in control of the vehicle, and trust me, I'm one of them, so I can say it. I have to look at my phone. I'm like, oh gosh, what's going to happen? There was no choice. And for Elijah setting this scene, he is setting this scene in such a way for the entire nation to leave no doubt. Fill the water up. Cover the wood in water. Cover the sacrifice. Fill the trench with water. The most precious commodity in this moment. We're going to repair the broken down altar of the Lord with the 12 tribes of Israel to symbolize this is who our God is for all generations. It's time for the showdown. It's sunset. Verse 36. At the time for the offering of the evening sacrifice, the prophet Elijah approached the altar and said, Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and notice the sub here, Israel. The people of God for all time. This is who he is. He subs out Jacob to intentionally put Israel in here to tell the people that are listening to him praying, he is your God. Even if you've abandoned him, he is yet to abandon you. Today, let it be known that you are God in Israel. I am your servant, and at your word I have done all these things. Answer me, Lord. Answer me that this people will know that you, the Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. You see, for the nation of Israel who have decided to play this or that and try to ride the fence in the middle, they're trying to say, oh, well, we haven't abandoned God, but God knew that their hearts had already turned away from him in trust. So Elijah's prayer is, God, get a hold of their hearts again. Because if I can get a hold of their heart, if you will get a hold of their heart, you will have their obedience. It'll follow after their heart. Elijah, in his simple 2-line prayer, calls on the God historically, say, God, the way that you've provided in the past, provide right now. Elijah placed himself based on his own identity off the identity of who his God was. He said, I am your servant. Let it be known that I've done everything you've asked me to do. His identity was placed in who God was, and that informed who he was and how he acted. And his call of action was for God to deal with his people in the way that God's own heart was shaped to do so. God, get a hold of their hearts again. He could have prayed anything. God, show them your God. Punish them. Kill half of them. Like there's times in the Old Testament when stuff like that happens. But what does Elijah pray in this moment? God, get a hold of their hearts again. Pull them close again. Turn their hearts back towards you. And what 450 prophets dancing around like fools couldn't accomplish all day long, God did in a brief moment before sunset. He set fire to the altar. Verse 38. Then the Lord's fire fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell face down and said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. It begs us to go back to the original verse that started all of this scene all over again. In verse 21, where the people could not answer. But now they did. But let's not forget, they only answered from their silence because God spoke first. You see, when the people could not give a response, Yahweh did. He responded from fire falling from heaven. And when all of the world's creation was wondering about of who is God, what should we worship, where should we go, God responded first by sending his one and only Son. He acted first. So let us never miss happenstance or mistaken that we worked our way to God, or we can prove our love for him, or we can ransom him to love us more. No, every single story of the scriptures is pointing of how God spoke first. Jesus spoke first by denying himself to leave heaven and come to earth in the helpless form of a newborn baby. Jesus denied himself all the way through his life on earth in all of his sinless perfection. He took up his cross, took up our cross. And he tells those around him to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow after him. His command to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength is simply a response to a God who has loved you fully and spoke first, and shown you how much he loved you. When you could not respond on who God is, God did through Christ. He spoke first. He stepped into your brokenness of your wayward heart, my wayward heart, lived perfectly, died in your place, and yet did not stay dead. The beauty and the glory of the cross and the gospel is he's coming after you and me. We're silent Israel, toddling the fence. You and I were not Elijah in all of our boldness, saying, leave no doubt. We're Israel straddling the fence of like, I want this and maybe a little of that. And every single human heart is an invisible altar where a war is waged between flesh and spirit, where a battle is sought out in the areas of our life of control. Will it be the spirit that wins or your flesh? And what will you sacrifice on that altar? Will it be God's lordship and saying, I'll give that up so I can keep this? Or will we surrender areas of control of our life to seek to let the Lord lead and let God be God? He spoke first. Would you consider asking the Lord of the areas of your life that you often too easily give up control to an idol? Whatever that idol is. And for you to surrender control back to him, you don't need a flat top surface of wood and stone or hay and stubble. You don't need gold. You don't need any of that, because your heart is that altar. And you can surrender to God through your heart anytime, any place. You can have straight access to him because of who Christ is and what he's done on your behalf. You see, the showdown over your heart has already took place. And the God who stepped out of heaven and came to earth and died in your place, he didn't stay dead. He got back up out of the grave. And the author of Hebrews writes it like this in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. He says, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run the race with endurance that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that was before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You see, he bore your burden. He took your shame. Will you turn to him? Just a few prayer prompt questions for you before we stand and respond in worship. Where's your focus at this morning? If you could imagine in your mind standing at a mountain of one man saying, choose for yourself. Who are you going to serve? This or that? Where are you at this morning? Have you made recent choices in your heart that set your focus adrift? Have there been choices in a hobby, a family situation, a work situation, whatever it may be, that has set your focus adrift? And how can you just surrender that idol? Remember, an idol's not always a terrible thing. It's a thing that we put in God's rightful place. It's so easy for us to think, oh, I'm not doing it like they did. It's different for me. That's an easy trap to step in. All of our hearts are a battleground for flesh and spirit. How can you today surrender to Christ? I'm just going to simply invite you to close your eyes and bow your heads, or just get in a prayer posture you feel comfortable with. Just want to give you a few moments of silence to seek the Lord and ask yourself that question of, are there any idols in your own heart? Is there any decisions that you've made that have set your focus adrift of pursuing something to be put in God's place that only He deserves to be in? What weapons or strategies right now are Satan using in your life to get you to put anything in God's rightful place? And as you think about that, how can you also respond with gratitude and thanksgiving and say, Jesus, thank you for speaking first. Jesus, in all of our waywardness and all of our sinfulness, our hearts were far from you and turned away from you in an effort to play both. And in our silence, you spoke first. You displayed your love for us by stepping out of heaven and coming to earth. Jesus, thank you for speaking first. God, may we respond with gratitude and thanksgiving of a grateful heart because you spoke first. Jesus, we love you. We thank you for the cross and the fact that because of it, we can be called your sons and daughters. God, will somebody today respond to your word and surrender their life to you for maybe the very first time? Or for others, would there be idols that are dethroned today as we process, as we pray, as we seek you? In your name we pray these things. Hey, as we get ready to respond in worship, there's going to be some prayer team members and elders and spouses down front who would love to pray with you. I'm just going to invite you to stand and simply respond to God's word as you feel led.